You're listening to the Sex and Psychology Podcast, the sex ed you never got in school and won't get anywhere else. I am your host, Dr. Justin Lehmiller. I am a social psychologist and research fellow at the Kinsey Institute and author of the book, Tell Me What You Want, The Science of Sexual Desire and How It Can Help You Improve Your Sex Life. When people experience sexual problems, such as low desire, performance anxiety, or concerns about their porn use, the instinct is often to ask, what's wrong with me? Or how do I fix this? But what if those sexual struggles were telling us something really important about ourselves? Sexual problems can actually be meaningful signals. They're clues that our minds and bodies are communicating that something deeper needs attention. Today, we're going to explore a very different way of understanding sexual difficulties, not as signs of dysfunction, but as doorways into deeper emotional and relational truths, as well as opportunities for real change rather than just symptom management. My guest is Julianne Maxwald, a licensed psychoanalyst, couples therapist, and AASECT certified sex therapist based in New York City. She has over 15 years of experience working with individuals and couples. She is the author of the new book, Psychoanalytic Sex Therapy, Exploring the Unconscious Life of Sexuality. This is going to be a fascinating conversation that you won't want to miss. Stick around and we're going to jump in right after the break. Do you ever find yourself dreaming about a career where you get to talk about sex and psychology all day long? What if I told you there's a place that can connect you with world-class experts and has a large, thriving community? Sexual Health Alliance does just that. Sexual Health Alliance helps you to build the career of your dreams and is at the forefront of sexuality education. Students come from all parts of the world and from all types of backgrounds. Whether you're in school just starting out on your journey or building advanced skills in your profession, Sexual Health Alliance's comprehensive certifications, engaging events, and self-paced online education will move you beyond the basics and set you up to become sexceptional. Visit sexualhealthalliance.com and start building the sexuality career of your dreams today. And let them know that you heard about Sexual Health Alliance on this podcast. Hi, Julianne, and welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Well, it's wonderful to have you here. So you have a new book out on psychoanalytic sex therapy, which I'm really excited to speak with you about. One of the big ideas in this book is that sexual difficulties aren't just problems in need of fixing. Rather, they can actually be really meaningful signals about what's happening emotionally or relationally beneath the surface. And I think that's such a powerful and important reframe because it shifts the question from how do we fix this to what might this be trying to tell us? So to start us off, can you explain what you mean by treating sexual symptoms as a form of unconscious communication?
Well, you actually described it really, really well. I don't think of sexual symptoms or difficulties or problems as something necessarily to fix, but rather I think of them as messages to decode or messages that need to be heard, a puzzle, so to speak, from the body or from the mind that the words haven't yet been able to describe or articulate.
Yeah, that makes total sense to me because, when it comes to sexual problems and difficulties that people have, they often want to think about like, oh, this is just a, physical problem or issue with my body and I can just take a pill to fix it. And I think that's why a lot of people's instinct is let's go see someone and let's fix this sexual problem as quickly as possible. And, that's why so many people would just like to take a pill and put it behind them as fast as they can. But what do we lose sight of when we rush straight into fixing or managing a sexual symptom instead of first getting curious about the deeper issues? Why is this so important?
Right. Absolutely. Like I understand the urgency when there is a sexual issue. There's a real urgency around fixing this, particularly if it's a dynamic with a couple or even if it's just within yourself. And it's so easy to get caught up in the anxiety and the desire to help or the desire to just change or fix the behavior. But what I find that if you really just slow down and try to unpack or decode exactly what that symptom is organizing within a person or the larger dynamic that's at play, you really then begin to get to the deeper issues where real change can actually begin to take place. I mean, you can change behavior, and that's important. I mean, behavioral interventions are super important, but if they're not embedded in the deeper context of what's going on, they don't really create lasting change.
Yeah. And I think that's also the problem with the just take a pill approach to a lot of sexual issues, because while that pill might help you in that moment, it's not getting at the deeper issues. And you're going to become dependent upon that pill to sexually perform, right? And when you work on these deeper issues, then you find something that can provide that meaningful, long lasting change that doesn't make you dependent on some pharmacological intervention. So, in your book, one of the case examples you discuss is the story of this patient, Maurice, who actually comes in for a drinking issue, right? He comes to see you because he says alcohol consumption is kind of out of control and it's not a sex problem. But it's not until much later in his work in therapy with you that a sexual concern comes out. So, I wanted to ask, why do you think people so often lead with something that's less vulnerable or talk about a non-sexual problem? What does that tell us about the shame or fear that people have around their sexual struggles?
Right. Absolutely. I think it's exactly that there's so much shame and fear for how they'll be perceived, or even just their own ability to feel comfortable talking about something that for many people, they've never talked about at all. And so it's much easier to come in and talk about something adjacent or a real problem that they have. And once they begin to feel comfortable with you, once they begin to just settle a little bit in the experience, feel like they can reveal whether it's a sexual issue or just deeper issues that arise in them.
Yeah, and that's what you really have to do as a sex therapist is you have to become a trusted confidant for the patients who come in, right? Because many people aren't even comfortable talking about sex with their own partners, let alone with anybody else in their life. And so how do you get somebody to open up about something like a sexual struggle or difficulty, which is something that people often feel so much shame about? When people experience a sexual problem, it's often felt as a personal failure in some way, right? And so that also just creates these layers upon layers of shame and anxiety that you have to break through. And so, yes, I mean, sometimes in the therapeutic process, it takes a long time to actually even just uncover the real issue that's at play, right?
Yes, absolutely. And I think it's interesting in more general psychotherapy, or certainly in psychoanalysis, you're not necessarily introducing new ideas. You're waiting for things to come up. With sex and sex therapy, I think it's very different. You have to take more of a active approach and kind of normalize that conversation and model in a way what it means to talk about sex and sexuality in a way that is instructive or curious or educational, and give people the language, or at least model what that language can look like or what the experience can feel like to have a regular conversation around sex and sexuality.
Yeah. So one of the things I really like about your book is that you give these case examples in every chapter that kind of really illustrate what it is that you're talking about. And they make the information so relatable and accessible. And so, as I mentioned, one of the examples was this case of this patient, Maurice. These are fictional names, of course, to protect patient confidentiality. But he comes in for a drinking problem and later discovers there's a sexual concern that we need to talk about. So can you tell us a little bit about his story? We'll dive into some of the specific aspects of it a little bit later, but just so my listeners kind of understand, what is the case here? Like, what was he coming in with and what did it turn out the real issue was?
Yeah, sure. So he came in concerned about his drinking. He's a chef at a high-end restaurant. He would tend to go out with his coworkers after the night of service, and he would come home in the early morning. His girlfriend was often waiting up furious because he was home late and drunk, and they would fight for a few hours. He would crash and pass out, and she would go to work, and this cycle was repeating itself for a few months. So that's why he came in. And we were able to really kind of stabilize things pretty early on. Within a few months, we had talked about he would give himself one night a week where he went out with his colleagues and friends. He would cut back down on his drinking. And that worked out really well. She was appreciative. He felt better, more in control. And so it was probably 3 months in where he said, I'm great. I'm really grateful that everything is going well, but that's actually not what I'm most concerned about, there's this other thing going on. And that's when he started to reveal he was concerned about his pornography use that was increasing. And we explored that. We started to talk about what his pornography use was. And he described how during the day, because he was home during the day, he went to his shifts in the evening, he was starting to watch more and more pornography. And it originally started because he was starting to feel a little disinterested in sex with his partner, who I call Sasha. And the sex was starting to feel a little routine, although, he still enjoyed it, but it was starting to feel a little routine. And he was using pornography to help him stay aroused or give him a fantasy that he could think about and use as they were having sex. And so, there were a few ways that I could have taken this. And one of them would have just been to focus on his porn use and to try to manage it, in a behavioral way. And we did a little bit of that. But instead, I started to ask him, well, can you tell me what kind of pornography you're watching? And I started to get really interested in what he was watching. And it turned out that there was a repeated theme that kept coming up, that he was really interested in porn, where there was an older woman who was kind of seducing a younger man. And, there were millions of variations to this theme, but this was a theme that always came up, that was always coming up for him. What we realized was that there was a lot of insecurity in his life. There was a lot of ways that he was feeling undervalued. And part of that was at work with his compensation. He felt like he wasn't really making enough money. Another part of it was that he really wanted to move the relationship forward. He was thinking about marriage, but he was fearful that Sasha wasn't interested or wasn't thinking along the same lines. And he wasn't talking about any of this. And one of the most important features is that during partnered sex, he was having more and more problems with erections. And so in part, he was either avoiding having sex with Sasha, or he was using more porn to try to keep himself aroused, give him something to think about as they were having partnered sex. And so, we slowed this whole thing down a little bit. Like, we really just slowed this whole thing down. And through talking about the kind of porn that he was watching, we realized that he was feeling a lot of pressure to perform, that his self-worth was so much attached to feeling like he could provide something to Sasha. And there was a lot of shame attached to that, not only in the drinking problem, but also feeling like she was making more money than him, that he was more invested in the relationship in a long-term way than she was. There was a lot of insecurity, a lot of fear, a lot of trying to protect himself against the kind of dependency that he was feeling in the relationship. And so being able to talk about this, him having a place where he could talk about this and understand it a little bit better and just process some of the emotions, get clear about what was really going on in all these different areas of his life, helped him then come up with a plan where he could actually start addressing some of these more consciously, more proactively. And so we did make a plan for him to reduce his porn use. And that helped just in general with his arousal. But then we also made a plan for him to ask for a raise at work, which he was successful with. And then we also made a plan for him to just speak more openly and honestly with Sasha about his interest in potentially getting engaged. And she was very responsive to that. She also wanted to do that. And so helping him just be a little more proactive reduced a lot of the shame, created a sense of empowerment for him. This is probably like 6 months worth of work together. And then the last piece of this was for him to bring up to Sasha what his fantasy was. And this was a really big one for him because he wasn't sure how she would interpret it, what she would think about it. their sex script all along was that he was kind of the initiator. He was very focused on making sure she had an orgasm first and that she, received pleasure. And so revealing this kind of vulnerable fantasy where he was being pursued and wanted and desired felt really threatening to him, scary. But he did. And it turned out that she really enjoyed the idea. She enjoyed the idea of bringing more novelty into their relationship and into their sex play, and loved the idea of role playing this fantasy and being this confident, hungry, sexually hungry woman who could pursue. And so it kind of turned their whole script upside down. And they had a tremendous amount of fun playing with this. And it really opened up the idea that the two of them could play with roles and with their sex script and add variety and even watch porn together. They kind of brought that into their sex play too. So there was a lot that happened. That's a very sort of condensed version of it.
Hey guys, have you ever wanted more from your orgasms? Then you're going to want to check out Load Boost from VB Health. VB Health has a simple mission: creating supplements that work. Load Boost is designed to improve the taste, volume, and overall health of your semen. This doctor-formulated supplement can help to enhance your orgasms and pleasure and support your fertility at the same time. VB Health takes quality seriously. Made in the USA and NSF certified, their products are produced in an FDA-registered facility. They even share their third-party lab results publicly because they value trust and transparency. This isn't anything like the junk they're selling in a gas station. Thousands of guys from all across the US and 45 different countries have already tried Load Boost, and over 88% of the reviews are 4 or 5 stars from verified buyers. Elevate your performance with Load Boost. You just might become someone's new favorite performer. Learn more and get yours at loadboost.com. Visit loadboost.com and use code Justin for 10% off, or click the link in the show notes. Tired of resolutions that make you feel like you're not enough? Same. Every year we tell ourselves that we need to be better, that we need to be thinner, stronger, or more disciplined. And we rarely stop to ask whether any of that is actually making us happier or more connected to ourselves and the people we love. So this year, I'm choosing something different. I'm choosing pleasure instead of pressure. And I'm choosing curiosity instead of self-criticism. And that's why I want to tell you about Beducated. Beducated is an online learning platform with over 150 courses on sex and intimacy taught by real experts. These courses help you to explore your sexuality in a safe, shame-free way at your own pace. What I love most about Beducated is that it reframes sex from something you're naturally supposed to be good at into something that you're allowed to learn about. It gives you permissions to ask questions and to explore. That shift alone can be a total game changer. So if you want to make this year less about fixing yourself and more about understanding yourself, click the link in the show notes to check out Beducated. Kick off your journey by taking Beducated's quiz to get your personalized roadmap to sexual happiness. Well, I love the way you describe that. I think it's such a great story. And the way that you approach this situation, I think really helps to illustrate the value of that psychoanalytic approach. A lot of people would have looked at this situation and said, that guy has a porn addiction and we just need to cut the porn out of his life entirely and all of his problems will go away. And he probably has porn-induced erectile dysfunction. And so you just need to get rid of the porn and then the penis will start working again. And, as you described, there's a lot of other stuff that was going on here. Porn was a symptom of something else. And I think that's really a problem in the way that so many issues around problematic porn use are treated, is that they focus on treating the symptom, which is the pornography use, and they don't get into the deeper issue. I mean, that was what I was thinking the whole time you were describing this, is that I know a lot of other therapists and practitioners who would have taken a totally different lens and approach here and would have just done let's cut out the porn use and let's treat this like an addiction. But when you treat things like that, you might be missing out on a lot of other layers and depth and things that are going on here.
Right. Absolutely. What I find too is that a lot of therapists that I supervise, for example, are really fearful of getting into what is the fantasy? What are you watching?
Mm-hmm.
But for me, I mean, and your work brings this up too. Like the fantasy is so rich. There's so many layers to what fantasies mean for people, and they mean all different kinds of things for different people. And so, from a psychoanalytic view, they're like dreams.
Yeah.
It's the template for the unconscious to just project everything onto. So, there's so much information. And if you can get curious about it, you can help your client or your patient get curious about it. It just opens up. Like there are always themes. And I say this like literally with 99% certainty that there are always themes in sex that are representative of what's going on in your life. And so looking at it through that lens, sex just becomes this really interesting arena to talk about all kinds of different things.
Yeah. And, that's something I talk about in my book, Tell Me What You Want, that our fantasies do have deeper meaning. They tell us something about ourselves, where we are in our lives right now, and what it is that we really want and need. If our fantasies were just totally random and didn't have any deeper meaning, when I started looking at how things like specific fantasies correlated with your personality traits or your attachment style or your history with sexual trauma, you wouldn't find anything statistically significant. If fantasies were just random noise, there wouldn't be a consistent pattern of associations. But what I see in study after study after study that I've done is that our fantasies do very consistently correlate with a lot of different aspects of the self. And so in that way, they can be very revealing. Now, by the same token, I do think that sometimes we run the risk of over-interpreting or over-analyzing certain fantasies.
Yes.
I think, like Freud said, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. I think in some cases, a fantasy is just a fantasy. Like, for example, people who score very high in the personality trait of openness to experience and who are very sensation-seeking types, they fantasize more about almost everything. And it doesn't always have deeper meaning. Sometimes it just means like you're a very imaginative, creative person who likes thrilling and exciting experiences. And, that's true sometimes, but I think more often than not, there is that deeper layer or subtext to the fantasy that we often don't consciously recognize.
Right. It's worth exploring. I actually have an addendum to the book that's called A Cigar is Just a Cigar, because sometimes it's exactly right. Like we can really get lost in overanalyzing things and our bodies, people just have different physical preferences too. Like our bodies in a way have a mind of their own. So I agree with you on that.
So beyond looking at someone's fantasies, you can also look at the details of how sex actually unfolds for them. Who initiates it, what happens first, what happens next, and where do things get stuck? So in other words, we're talking about the sexual script here. So why is looking at the actual structure and flow of sex often more revealing than asking questions like, how often do you have sex? Or do you want more sex or less sex than you're having? Why is it important to really look at and understand that sexual script?
Right. Well, that really, in a way, is the choreography of what happens. And there's so much that is revealing, even the way that people approach describing their sex script or their sex act. You can learn so much about people's comfort levels, talking about things or what they're comfortable with or what they're not comfortable with. It's really the unfolding of the sex script where you learn so much information.
Yeah, and that's where Ian Kerner's book, which I think is called Tell Me About the Last Time You Had Sex. He was a guest on the podcast some time back. I think is really helpful and valuable because he kind of approaches his work as a sex therapist as a sort of sex detective, where he kind of wants to explore the scene, like where things actually happened and how did things unfold. And I think that is a really useful framework for really trying to understand, okay, what is actually going on and where are the problem points and where are things getting stuck and how analyzing that script can teach us different ways of approaching sex in the future where we might not get stuck in those places.
Right. I find also if you're working with a couple and you ask them about their sex script, for the first time, they're really able to actually talk about what they like and maybe even what they don't like, because it's much harder to have that conversation with your partner if neither one of you feels really fluent or confident in terms of what's happening between the two of you or in sex with sex in general. So I find that incredibly useful to just really open up an honest conversation around like, oh, well, did you enjoy that? Or would you like more of something? And I find that helping therapists get more comfortable being curious about the specific details and helping them understand that this isn't voyeurism. It's really useful for clients or patients to be able to talk about this with somebody who can help kind of guide them and normalize things or just give them language to talk about their preferences.
Yeah, totally. Now, something I found really interesting about Maurice's story is that his healing didn't mean totally eliminating porn from his life entirely. It meant changing what porn was doing for him, shifting it from this private escape and a way of avoiding anxiety into something that could be playful and even connecting. And, like I said, that's so different from how a lot of other people would approach somebody who has a problem with porn, where they would say, you just need to stop that entirely if you want to be healthy and have a positive sex life again. But can you talk to us a little bit more about that shift, of going from porn as avoidance to porn as play and connection? Why was that more important than simply trying to get rid of the behavior? And, what does that tell us more broadly about recovery in terms of dealing with sexual issues?
Right, absolutely. For Maurice and Sasha in particular, it was such a invitation for them to bring novelty and variety into their relationship. And for him, it was in some ways two-pronged because he was using it compulsively and avoidantly in the beginning. And so it was important in the beginning, at least in the same way that he kind of behaviorally cut down on his drinking, it was important for him to reduce his porn use. And, his arousal increased and all of those things were helpful and useful. But then it became really important for him and Sasha to be able to bridge that. And part of that was reducing the shame around porn in general. I mean, there's nothing inherently bad or wrong about porn. It's how you're using it in your relationship. If you're using it as a way to add novelty, increase stimulation, for pleasure, for ideas, it's a tool like anything else. And for him in particular, it was a way for him to really be open and honest with Sasha about what was interesting to him and why. And it just allowed them to play with fantasy in general. And sometimes it's not like they used porn every single time they had sex, but play and fantasy was introduced in their relationship. And they watched porn sometimes, and sometimes they role played different scenarios. But the shame was gone. It was something that they could do together. It was playful. It was fun. It really added a positive element to the relationship.
Yeah. And, porn is one of those topics that people have such a hard time talking about. And, there's so much ideology that goes into conversations about porn, where there are a lot of people who just argue that porn is inherently bad and never has positive implications or effects. But I think, as you describe here, here's an example of how porn can actually be a pathway to vulnerability and talking about fantasies and getting at what people really want. And that can actually help them to connect on a deeper level. And in addition, it can be used in a way that sort of promotes some novelty and add some more excitement to a couple's sex life. And so I think you're totally right in saying, porn isn't inherently good or bad. It's all in how you use it. And there are lots of ways in which couples can use porn to promote deeper connection, more vulnerability, and more novelty into their relationship.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, Julianne, this conversation has been absolutely fascinating. I've really enjoyed discussing psychoanalytic sex therapy, and I'm really looking forward to continuing our conversation and diving even deeper in the next episode. Can you please tell my listeners where they can go to learn more about you and your work and get a copy of your new book?
Absolutely. And thank you for having me. This has been great. People can find me at my website, which is www.juliannemaxwell.co. Seatville. They can also find me on Instagram at Julianne Maxwald. And my book is available on the Routledge website with a 20% off discount. And it's also available on Amazon.
And your book is called Psychoanalytic Sex Therapy, Exploring the Unconscious Life of Sexuality. I'll be sure to include links to all of that in the show notes. Thank you again so much for your time. I really appreciate having you here.
Thanks, Justin. It's been great. Thank you.
Thank you for listening. To keep up with new episodes of this podcast, visit my website, Sex and Psychology, at sexandpsychology.com, or subscribe on your favorite platform, where I hope you'll take a moment to rate and review the show. If you listen on Apple Podcasts, please consider becoming a Sex and Psychology Premium subscriber to enjoy ad-free listening for just $3.99 a month. You can also follow me on social media for daily sex research updates. I'm on Blue Sky and X at Justin Lehmiller and Instagram at Justin J. Lehmiller. Also, be sure to check out my book, Tell Me What You Want. Thanks again for listening. Until next time.